The prairie wind carried more than dust that October evening when Martha Calloway stood before her newly painted front door, watching the last light of day fade behind the rolling hills. She'd spent 3 days applying coat after coat of that bold red paint she'd ordered special from Kansas City, determined to make her mark on this harsh frontier land. Her husband Samuel had warned her against it, his weathered hands gesturing toward their modest cabin as he shook his head. "Some colors just don't belong in a home, Martha," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of generations who'd learned hard lessons about inviting trouble through an open door. But Martha was young then, barely 22, with dreams bigger than the endless sky above their homestead. She'd grown up in a gray clapboard house back in Pennsylvania where her mother kept everything muted and proper, where color was something you admired in other people's gardens, but never dared bring into your own sacred space. When she and Samuel had claimed their 160 acres under the Homestead Act, she'd promised herself things would be different. Their home would be vibrant, welcoming, alive with the kind of energy that could push back against the loneliness that seemed to seep from the very soil of this untamed country. The red door gleamed like a wound against the weathered wood siding, beautiful and startling in equal measure. Martha had chosen that particular shade because it reminded her of the wild roses that bloomed along the creek in summer, defiant splashes of color against the brown earth. She wanted everyone who passed their way to know that the Callaways weren't just surviving out here, they were thriving, bold enough to paint their door the color of life itself. Samuel emerged from the barn where he'd been tending to their mare, Bessie, who'd been favoring her left front hoof for the better part of a week. The concern on his face wasn't just for the horse, Martha could tell. He'd been watching her paint that door for 3 days, and each stroke of the brush had seemed to deepen the lines around his eyes. Samuel wasn't a man given to superstition, but he'd been born to prairie folk, raised on stories passed down from his grandmother, who'd come west in a covered wagon when Kansas was still wild territory. "Looks striking," he said, though his tone suggested he meant it as anything but a compliment. He pulled off his work gloves and tucked them into his belt, a gesture Martha had come to recognize as his way of preparing for a difficult conversation. "But I keep thinking about what old Mrs. Henderson told us when we first settled here." Martha felt her jaw tighten. Eleanor Henderson was their nearest neighbor, living a hard 5-mile ride to the east in a dugout home carved right into a hillside. At 73, she'd outlasted 2 husbands and raised 6 children on this unforgiving land, and she had opinions about everything from the proper way to preserve meat to the correct time for planting corn. Most of her advice proved valuable, earned through decades of trial and error, but some of it struck Martha as nothing more than old wives' tales dressed up as frontier wisdom. "Henderson has survived out here longer than most," Martha replied, running her hand along the smooth surface of the door. The paint was nearly dry now, and in the fading light it seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. "But that doesn't make everything she says gospel true. Sometimes a door is just a door, Samuel." But even as she spoke the words, Martha felt a flutter of unease in her chest. 3 days ago, when she'd first mixed the paint in the old tin bucket they used for everything from watering the chickens to washing clothes, their rooster had stopped crowing at dawn. Yesterday, Bessie had developed that mysterious limp. This morning she'd found their best laying hen dead in the coop with no apparent cause, her feathers still smooth and her eyes still bright, as if life had simply decided to leave her body behind. Samuel stepped closer to the door, studying the rich crimson finish. "My grandmother used to say that red draws things to it," he said quietly. "Not just good things, Martha, all kinds of things." She said it was like hanging a lantern in the dark and not knowing what might be drawn to the light. The comparison made Martha shiver despite the warm evening air. She'd grown up hearing similar warnings, though her mother had focused more on the practical considerations of maintaining a proper household. Red was the color of passion, of anger, of blood spilled in violence. It was bold where a home should be peaceful, demanding attention where a family needed privacy and protection. Her mother had always insisted that a home should be painted in colors that promoted harmony and rest, earth tones that connected the family to the stability of the natural world. But Martha had rebelled against that philosophy, tired of living in spaces that felt more like hiding places than homes. She wanted to create something beautiful, something that would stand out against the endless brown of the prairie like a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. She'd imagined travelers stopping to ask for water or directions, drawn by the welcoming glow of that red door, and she'd picture herself serving them coffee and fresh bread while they shared news from the outside world. The reality had proven more complicated than her imagination. Over the past 3 days, as the red paint had dried and settled into its final brilliant shade, Martha had noticed changes in the rhythm of their daily life. The usual sounds of the prairie seemed sharper somehow, more insistent. Coyotes called longer into the night, their voices carrying an edge of hunger that made her pull the quilt up to her chin. The wind rattled the windows with unusual persistence, and twice she'd woken to find their water barrel overturned in the morning, though neither she nor Samuel could explain how it had happened. Most troubling of all were the visitors who'd begun appearing along their property line. Not people, exactly, but shadowy figures that seemed to watch their cabin from the edge of the wheat field. Samuel had ridden out twice to investigate, but each time he'd found nothing more than disturbed grass and the lingering scent of something he couldn't quite identify. Something wild and hungry and altogether too interested in their little homestead. "Maybe we should consider repainting," Samuel suggested gently, though Martha could hear the reluctance in his voice. He hated to see his money wasted on supplies they'd had to order special from town, and paint wasn't cheap when you were trying to build a life from nothing on government land. "Just until we get more established out here. Maybe a nice brown or green, something that blends in better with the landscape." Martha's first instinct was to refuse, to defend her choice and insist that they were being foolish, letting old superstitions influence decisions that should be based on practical consideration. The red door was beautiful, exactly what she'd envisioned, and changing it now would feel like admitting defeat. But as she stood there in the gathering dusk, watching the last light reflect off that brilliant crimson surface, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her in return. The feeling had started the morning after she'd applied the final coat of. She'd been hanging laundry on the line behind their cabin when she'd felt eyes on her, that unmistakable sensation of being observed. She'd turned to look toward the wheat field, expecting to see Samuel returning from checking their property lines, but instead she'd caught a glimpse of something else entirely. Something that moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but seemed too large to be any animal she recognized from this part of Kansas. That evening she'd mentioned the incident to Samuel over supper, trying to keep her voice casual as she ladled beans onto his plate. He'd listened without comment, but she'd seen the way his hand had moved instinctively toward the rifle they kept propped beside the kitchen table. After 20 years on the frontier, Samuel had developed instincts that kept them alive, and those instincts were telling him that something had changed since Martha had painted their door that particular shade of red. "Tell me again what Miss Henderson said about red," Martha found herself asking, though she'd dismissed the old woman's warnings just 3 days earlier. Now, with shadows lengthening across their property and that strange feeling of being watched growing stronger by the hour, those warnings seemed less like superstition and more like hard-earned wisdom. Samuel leaned against the porch railing, his eyes scanning the horizon where the wheat field met the darkening sky. "She said red calls to things that are hungry," he replied slowly, as if he were remembering the exact words. "Not just hungry for food, but hungry for all kinds of things. Attention, energy, life itself." She said the old Indian tribes in this area used red paint for war ceremonies, to call fighting spirits and to mark themselves as ready for battle. According to her, painting your home red was like sending out an invitation to every restless spirit within 100 miles, letting them know you were ready to take on whatever they might bring. The words sent a chill down Martha's spine, though she tried to tell herself it was just the evening breeze picking up. But she couldn't deny that their peaceful homestead had felt less peaceful since the door had been painted. The very air around their cabin seemed charged with possibility, as if something momentous were building just beyond the edge of perception. Their closest neighbors, the Morrison family who lived 8 miles to the south, had mentioned strange dreams when they'd stopped by yesterday to borrow sugar. Jane Morrison had described nightmares filled with red light and voices calling her name from outside their cabin window. Her husband Tom had laughed it off as nothing more than the result of too much coffee before bed. But Martha had seen the concern in Jane's eyes. Living on the frontier taught you to pay attention to changes in routine, to variations in the normal patterns that could signal approaching trouble. Even their livestock seemed affected by the change. The chickens had stopped laying regularly, and their milk cow had begun producing half her normal amount, despite having access to the same pasture she'd been grazing for months. Most concerning of all, their dog Rex had taken to sleeping inside the cabin instead of on the porch where he'd always preferred to keep watch over their property. Rex was a brave dog bred for frontier life, and Martha had never seen him show fear of anything larger than himself, until this week. As if summoned by her thoughts, Rex emerged from inside the cabin and positioned himself between Martha and the painted door. His ears were pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest as he stared out toward the wheat field. The sound made Martha's skin prickle with unease. Rex never growled unless he sensed genuine danger, and his instincts had saved their lives more than once during their 3 years on this homestead. "You see it too, don't you, boy?" Samuel murmured, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ear. Rex's tail didn't wag at the attention, remaining rigid and alert as his eyes tracked something moving through the tall wheat that neither Martha nor Samuel could see clearly. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the hills now, leaving only a thin line of orange light along the western horizon. In the gathering darkness, the red door seemed to glow with its own inner fire, more vibrant now than it had appeared during the bright afternoon hours. Martha found herself drawn to that luminous surface, mesmerized by the way the color seemed to shift and dance in the changing light. "Martha," Samuel's voice cut through her trance, sharp with urgency. "Look at me, not at the door." She blinked and turned toward her husband, surprised to realize she'd been staring at the painted surface for several minutes without being aware of the passage of time. Samuel's face was tight with concern, and Rex had moved even closer to her side, his body tense and ready for action. "What just happened?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. She'd felt pulled toward that red surface, drawn by something stronger than simple aesthetic appreciation. For those few minutes nothing had existed except that brilliant crimson color and the strange sense that it was trying to communicate something important, something she needed to understand. "You were listening to something," Samuel replied, his hand moving to rest on the rifle stock. "Your head was tilted like you were hearing voices, but you didn't respond when I called your name. It's happening more often since you finished painting the door." Martha felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She'd been losing time more frequently over the past few days, finding herself standing before the red door with no memory of walking there, no recollection of what had drawn her from whatever task she'd been performing. At first she'd attributed these episodes to simple distraction, the natural result of being proud of her handiwork. But Samuel's observation suggested something more troubling was occurring. The wheat field rustled in the evening breeze, and Martha could swear she heard something moving through the tall stalks with deliberate purpose. Not the random scurrying of small animals or the irregular pattern of wind-blown grain, but the steady progress of something large making its way toward their cabin. Rex's growl deepened, and he took a protective step forward, placing his body squarely between the approaching sound and his human family. "We should go inside," Samuel suggested, though Martha could tell he was trying not to sound alarmed. "Early start tomorrow, and we need to check on Bessie's hoof again before we lose the light completely." But Martha found herself reluctant to leave the porch, drawn by a curiosity that felt both foreign and familiar. Whatever was making its way through their wheat field was connected to the red door somehow, she was certain of it. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, the pull she felt too strong to be dismissed as imagination. "Just a few more minutes," she heard herself saying, though she hadn't consciously decided to speak. "I want to see what's coming." Samuel's hand closed firmly around her arm, his calloused fingers gentle but insistent. "Martha, listen to me. Whatever's out there, it's not something we want to meet in the dark. We're going inside now, and tomorrow we're going to town for different paint." The mention of repainting the door sent a shock of something like grief through Martha's chest. The thought of covering that beautiful red surface with mundane brown or green felt like a betrayal of everything she'd hoped to create on this homestead. But as she looked into Samuel's worried eyes, and felt Rex trembling with tension against her leg, she realized that her attachment to the color had grown beyond simple aesthetic preference. She was being influenced by something she didn't understand, drawn into patterns of behavior that felt both natural and deeply wrong. The red door had become more than decoration, it had become a focal point for energies and intentions that had no place in a home meant to shelter and protect a growing family. The sound in the wheat field grew closer, accompanied now by a rustling that seemed too organized to be natural wind. Martha could make out what looked like a path being created through the grain, stalks bending aside to allow passage for something moving with clear purpose toward their cabin. The path was wide enough for a man, but the way the wheat parted suggested something that moved differently than any human would. "Inside," Samuel repeated, his voice carrying the authority he used when their safety was genuinely at stake. "Now, Martha." This time she didn't resist, allowing him to guide her toward the cabin door, but as they reached the threshold, she couldn't help but look back at that glowing red surface one more time. In the near-complete darkness, the door seemed to pulse like a living heart, and Martha could swear she heard something calling her name from the direction of the wheat field. Rex followed them inside, hackles raised and ears alert, positioning himself by the front window where he could keep watch over the approaches to their cabin. Samuel barred the door and checked the shutters, following the security routine they'd developed during their first winter when a pack of wolves had stalked their property for nearly a week. As they prepared for bed, Martha found herself glancing repeatedly toward the front of the cabin, drawn by an almost magnetic pull toward that red door even with solid walls between them. She could feel its presence like a warm spot against her consciousness, beckoning and promising things she couldn't quite articulate. Samuel noticed her distraction as she braided her hair for the night, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar motions, while her attention remained fixed on the front of the cabin. "Tomorrow we paint it brown," he said quietly, settling into bed beside her. "Nice, quiet brown that won't draw attention from anything we don't want visiting our homestead." Martha nodded, though the agreement felt like it was being torn from some deeper part of herself. The rational part of her mind recognized that Samuel was right, that the red door had brought changes to their peaceful life that threatened their safety and well-being. But another part of her, a part that seemed to have grown stronger since the painting was completed, rebelled against the idea of covering that brilliant surface with something dull and ordinary. As they lay in the darkness, Martha could hear movement outside their cabin, the sound of something circling their property with patient persistence. Rex remained alert by the window, occasionally releasing soft growls that indicated whatever was out there hadn't moved on as a normal animal would. The sounds continued for hours, sometimes close enough that Martha could hear individual footsteps, other times distant enough that she wondered if she was imagining them all together. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of red light and voices calling her name from impossible distances. In her dreams, the door opened onto landscapes she'd never seen, vast spaces filled with crimson sky and shadows that moved with intelligence and purpose. She found herself walking through these spaces with growing confidence, drawn forward by the promise of knowledge and power that seemed to emanate from the red light itself. She woke to find herself standing before the front door, her hand reaching for the latch. Samuel's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness, sharp with alarm and fear. "Martha, step away from the door." The sound of her name spoken in her husband's voice broke whatever spell had drawn her from their bed, and she stumbled backward, suddenly aware of the cold floorboards beneath her bare feet. Through the window she could see the red door glowing like an ember in the darkness, more vibrant now than it had ever appeared during daylight hours. "I was dreaming," she whispered, though she couldn't shake the feeling that what she'd experienced had been more real than any ordinary dream. "I was walking through places I've never been, but they felt familiar somehow, and there were others there, people who'd been drawn by the same red light that drew me." Samuel lit the oil lamp, filling their small cabin with warm, steady light that pushed back against the strange crimson glow visible through the shutters. In the lamp's gentle radiance, Martha felt more like herself again, grounded in the familiar reality of their homestead life. "It's calling to you," Samuel said simply, stating what they'd both begun to understand over the past few days. "Whatever energy that color draws, it's focused on you because you created it. You mixed the paint, you applied it, you put your intention into making it exactly what you wanted it to be." The observation made sense in a way that frightened Martha more than she wanted to admit. She'd poured her hopes and dreams into that painting project, determined to create something beautiful and bold that would stand as a symbol of their success on this harsh frontier. But perhaps in focusing so intently on making the color perfect, she'd opened herself to influences that had nothing to do with simple artistic expression.